Good morning. Good morning. I'd ask our guests to take their seats, please. We're going to get started here. We have a full day ahead of us. We want to make sure we have time to absorb all the important information. My name is Ronald Weich. I am the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our law school and to this very important convening on the foster care system. The Sarah and Neil Meyerhoff Center on Families, Children, and the Courts is one of the crown jewels of our law school. We're so proud of the work of this organization. And before I go any further, I want to introduce our namesake. Sarah Meyerhoff is here. We welcome her. Sarah comes to many of these events. She makes sure that the center named in her honor is doing good work, and we are. We try to make her proud. Here at the University of Baltimore School of Law, we teach our students that law is important, it's impactful, and it can impact people in good ways or not so good ways. And that's especially true of the way the law impacts children. It can be a great force for helping children develop and thrive, and it can also be quite a destructive force. And we teach our students that they need to discern the difference and to work to make sure that the law is helpful, not hurtful to people. The Center on Families, Children, and the Courts is deeply involved in the way that the law affects children here in Maryland and throughout really throughout the country, but especially here in Maryland and here in Baltimore. And we do that in several ways. First of all, we're directly involved with children. We work in the Baltimore City public schools and other schools around the state to combat chronic attendance problems, chronic absenteeism, and working with children and teachers and parents. We are making a difference in the lives of those children. But at the same time, the center plays a very important role in thinking about how systems work and how they can be improved. And convenings like this one are vitally important to that mission. And so I thank you all for being here to help us explore the foster care system, its flaws and alternatives to foster care, thinking about ways in which we can strengthen families instead of taking children away from their parents when that is not the best option. Leading our Center on Families, Children, and the Courts are two wonderful people, and I'm going to say a word about both of them. Our recently appointed executive director of the center, Aubrey Edwards-Luce, joined us just a couple of months ago from a distinguished career in this field in Washington, D.C., and she's going to be introduced more fully by the next person I will introduce, and that is my colleague, Professor Shanta Trivedi. Shanta joined us really just a couple of years ago, although she was here even before that as a fellow in our family law clinic, or Bronfine Family Law Clinic. Then she worked at the Georgetown University Law Center. And before that, she was a practicing attorney in both private practice and working in public defense in defense of families in New York. And Shanta has been a tremendous faculty director of the Sarah and Neil Meyerhoff Center for Families, Children, and the Courts. This is an organization that was founded by our great colleague, Barbara Babb. Some of you remember Barbara, who, for all I know, is watching on live stream right now. And Barbara did a great job of developing this center. And when Shanta came, we said to her, make it your own. Take this wonderful entity and make it even better and make it even more relevant to this community and especially to children and families. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to all of you Professor Shanta Trivedi.
So I'm not on this schedule. But my name is Shanta Trivedi, and I'm CFCC's faculty director. And Aubrey has kindly agreed to give me 3 of her minutes to give a little context. So when I was a teaching fellow here at UB, as Dean Weich referenced, this is my second time teaching at the University of Baltimore. I was looking for a topic for my first law review article. And I thought, what could I possibly write a law review article about? I don't know anything. And Professor Matt Fraden, who is a trusted friend and mentor who teaches at our neighboring law school at the University of the District of Columbia, suggested that I write about the harm of removal. And that I knew about, not personally, like a lot of you in our audience, but I'd witnessed babies torn from their mother's arms, toddlers clinging onto their parents' legs as they were physically removed, and children screaming as the courtroom doors shut. Even in cases where children needed to take a break from being with their families, the foster system did not serve them well. They ran away, they faced intense depression, they did not do better in the ways that the system promises. And I was coming from New York, a jurisdiction where courts were required not only to identify any harm that a parent or caregiver caused, but to see if that harm could be mitigated through services or through creative visitation arrangements, and then to balance whether that harm could be outweighed by the harm of removal. And I had no idea that other jurisdictions did not engage in this balancing test. I could not believe that New York and DC were the only jurisdictions in the country that took the harm of removal into account. Even without legislation, I wondered, how can you determine the best interests of the child, or whether it's contrary to a child's welfare to remain at home without considering the attachment to the parents, whether children would be separated from their siblings or have to switch schools, and whether a child would have to leave their community. So I wrote that article and I published it in 2019. In the interim, I had my second child. And since then, Washington State, Iowa, Montana, and Texas have passed harm of removal legislation. We hope that Maryland will be next. We're working on it. We've learned some of the mistakes that we've made in drafting and passing some of these laws in other states. But above all else, what I've learned from talking to people in these states is that legislation is not enough. We know that. The law is not enough. Education is really key. Like reasonable efforts, harm of removal inquiries can be pro forma without a real investigation into what the harms can look like. And we really hope that today is a part of that education. I see so many people in this audience who have been thinking deeply about these issues for a really long time, longer than I have. And we know that everyone comes to this work and to this space with very different experiences and very different perspectives. And we really hope that we can all learn from each other. We really hope primarily that you can learn from those who have been most impacted by our legal systems. And we want to learn from each other, talk to each other, and keep this conversation going. We are so grateful that you're here. We know how busy you all are, and we're excited that you took the time to be here. Hi to the people online, and we hope that you'll continue to engage with us after this event. And now, I think I used up my 3 minutes, maybe a little more, Aubrey. I'd like to now introduce you to CFCC's Executive Director, Aubrey Edwards-Luce. Aubrey comes to us from First Focus for Children, where she was the Vice President of Child Welfare and Youth Justice. And prior to First Focus, Aubrey was a senior policy attorney at the DC Children's Law Center, where she previously represented children as a guardian ad litem. I don't know why we still use Latin, doing direct representation of children in child welfare, custody, guardianship, and adoption proceedings. I hope if you get nothing else out of today, we hope that Aubrey and I have demonstrated that parents' attorneys and children's attorneys can work together productively for the benefit of kids and families, and we can even be friends. And with that, I'd like to welcome my new best friend, Aubrey Edwards-Luce.
Thank you, Shanta, for that kind introduction. Working with you has been nothing short of amazing. And I also want to thank you, Dean Weich, for your warm and unwavering support, and as well for Associate Dean Joy Gaslick. I know that she is going to be coming in and out today. Thank you both for your unwavering support for the center. And before I start kind of orienting us to why we're here today and what we're going to be able to learn, I got to take a second and thank my amazing team at CFCC for all of your support for making today happen. Between Shanta and Catrice Williams, Michelle Huang Plansky, who I think got to say hi to everybody as they were getting checked in, Kim Carlin, who's been holding it down for us on the communications front. You guys have just been so fantastic to making today happen. So thank you so much. Can you guys all clap for them for me? Thank you. And I would also be remiss if I didn't thank the rest of our staff. Arian, don't you go too far. Thank you for being here, sir. Arian and David Fishkin, Christopher Kelly, Rahina Zavala, thank you all for your help today. And then Christina Stoltz and Juan Pablo Soto, Jared Schuster, who's helping make all the AV things happen. Just thank you so much. And Laura Carter, thank you for getting that coffee because I know folks needed that this morning. Thank you all. Okay, and then I know, I'm sorry, there's a lot of thank yous. I have to say thank you so much, Sarah Meyerhoff, for being here and for your unwavering support of the center. Thank you to my husband for being here as well. Appreciate you. And then thank you so much to our sponsors, Grant Makers for Girls of Color, who's been a great support for our center and making sure everybody gets fed today. They aren't able to be here today because boo COVID, but we thank you so much for your support as well. I'm thankful for all of you for being here at CFCC, which is my new work home. So thank you all. Having just joined CFCC in July, I'm deeply humbled to have the honor to welcome you all to this very established event. Can you raise your hands if you've been to one of our previous 12 symposiums? Welcome back to all of you. Now raise your hands if this is your first time coming. All right, that's great. This is my first one in person. I did the last one virtually. So, and like I said, I'm new here. And being the newbie, I understand that it's a little bit weird that I'm going to be giving you some institutional knowledge because I've been here for all of 2 seconds, but please indulge me. I'm going to share a little bit about who I am, what CFCC is, before I get into how we're going to be going through today. So again, my name is Aubrey Edwards-Luce. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the executive director of CFCC, but my most beloved titles that I hold are wife, mom, godmom, sister, daughter, and granddaughter, and auntie. Love that one. My connections to people have always been super important to me ever since I was a little kid. And now I'm going to see if my slides work. When I was about 3 years old, my parents and my little sister and I had moved from Chicago to Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was the Energizer Bunny kid, for sure. And my mom was very wise. She took us to a playground one time, and she just was trying to make a dent in my energy reserves. And, you know, being a smart mom, this was early 1990s. So instead of helicoptering around me and my sister, which is what I do with my daughter, she sat on a bench and read a book. And I went off and played with some kids on the swings and slides. And then a couple minutes later, I came bounding up to her. It's like, mommy, come meet my new friends. And many things have changed about me since then. I've got more hair. I've about doubled in height. But I'm still like this, very quick to make strangers become new friends and quick to connect people to each other. But there is one thing that's very different about me since then. I've spent a lot of time learning and working. I've gotten a master's degree in social work and a law degree as well. I've had numerous jobs that are in and adjacent to the child and family and youth justice systems. My resume can tell you all about that. But I also come to CFCC with a type of education that you won't see on my resume. The most important things I've learned, the things that motivate me to advocate for community investment, racial justice, family integrity, and children's rights are the things that I've learned via my connection to my family. Let the circle be unbroken is a phrase that I learned when I became an Ojima leader this past summer with the National Adoption Association. During the Ojima think tank, we explored and experienced the power and strength of Black family connections. Being connected to my family has afforded me the opportunity to really stand on the shoulders of giants. Next to my connection to Jesus, the lessons I've learned from my family are what have made me who I am today. My parents were among the first of their families to graduate college and to go to graduate school. My grandparents, they picked cotton and produce, joined the Great Migration, and they were the first generation to vote. My 8 great-grandparents, they had just a diversity of experiences, from being sharecroppers that survived the terrors of Jim Crow, to working in mills, working for the military, working in offices. Some were light-skinned Black folks who had to live with the challenge and some privileges of being able to pass as white during the segregated time of America. Being connected to my family and my family history has gotten me through some of the most difficult courses that the class of life has had to offer me. For example, I learned how to trust my grit and to move far away from my family for the sake of education and schools, because I saw my parents do that. My grandfather, I knew that he had done a very similar thing for the sake of his safety, moving out of Mississippi, and for his livelihood as well. More recently, I've learned from my family how to keep on keeping on, as we say in the Black church tradition. I've learned this lesson as I've had to learn how to go on living after losing 2 of my children to miscarriage and stillbirth in the span of 5 years. It was the joy and the love that I saw continually expressed by my family, who had also lived through the death of their children, that taught me that resilience is my birthright. My family taught me how to grieve, how to remember, how to bask in the love and light of Jesus, even when death had ripped my heart out. My family has been my lifeline. And I think a lot of us can relate to that. You know, whether it's your chosen family or your family by blood, family are some of our most important teachers. And so when I imagine what my life might have been like had I missed out on some of those most important life lessons handed down around family room couches and kitchen tables, I'm almost moved to tears. My stomach churns and my soul aches when I think about how the lessons of thriving and surviving are stolen from children who are ripped away from their families through our court systems. Whether it's our immigration system or our family court system or juvenile court system, each of these systems have a way of separating children from their families. We treat that connection between children and their families and their parents as replaceable or disposable. And even when removal isn't carried out, it's the very threat of removal that has a very deep impact on the relationship between children and their parents. The very threat of removal instills a fear that taints the most important relationship for children. And then we've hidden this landmine of possible removal in their vicinity and asked them to walk through life as if everything's normal. And when they can't, we make good on that threat. We remove children from their parents, their siblings, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, their teachers, their schools, their friends. We essentially ask them to move a rowboat upstream with only 1 paddle. It's cruel. And CFCC believes that we can and must do better. I joined CFCC in July to help guide our center to the next phase of its evolution. I'm here to expand the impact of our programming and to build our policy work out. I'm also here to deepen our relationships with our students, the UBALT students, the students and children and families that we work with in Baltimore and the Baltimore community more broadly. I'm working to lead CFCC in a re-examination of the beliefs and the values and the principles that undergird everything that we do. We're changing. We're looking at the data. We're learning the often silenced individual and collective histories. We're having really hard conversations, like many organizations are having during this time of racial reckoning and the demands for racial justice. You're feeling all the feelings as we sort through what we must hold tight to and what we must let go of so that we can become the organization that we want to be. One that listens to lived expertise and works alongside students and children and parents and caregivers and the courts to create communities that can thrive, where families can thrive without unnecessary legal system involvement. It feels like a really big vision, but I'm so proud of our team for having the courage to dream it. As revolutionary and innovative and honestly scary as it feels to let go of the way things have been, I'm sure that the vision that we have is possible. What we're striving for is not theoretical, it's historical. The adage, it takes a village to raise a child, it has its basis in history. Communities have been helping parents support their children for as long as there have been aunties and uncles. When communities are liberated to love and are resourced to support, they can help parents weather the most tumultuous of storms. And CFCC is committed to working with a diverse group of partners to ensure communities can help families thrive, so courts are the last resort for family support. One of the ways that we do this is through our Tackling Chronic Absenteeism project. It's recently been renamed from the Truancy Court Project, but it's a nationally recognized model chronic absenteeism program that's won awards from the Harvard University JFK School of Government, as well as most recently from the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges. TCAP is a completely voluntary program that works with about 100 elementary, middle, and high school students each year. And we work with these students who are in Baltimore schools, and they're identified by their schools of having missed about 10 to 25% of the previous school days in the previous semester. And our TCAP team, which includes Rohina, who's our program coordinator, Christopher, our case manager, David, our attorney, and Arian, our mentor, these folks have such a compassionate heart for Baltimore's city students and families and parents and schools. The team is supported by interns who are UBalt students, some in our undergraduate program, some in law school, and they are also supported by legal professionals who help provide encouragement and accountability to the students as well. They meet, once a week to look over the child's attendance, find those places where they might be struggling. I actually had my first time as a volunteer. I'm one of those legal professionals. I couldn't tell you how many students were like, I don't have an alarm clock, so I don't get up for school. Sometimes it's simple things, but sometimes it's very systemic things. And so this program allows us to be able to see both of those individual levels and systemic things in ways that we can support families and children so that they can get to school. CFCC is currently exploring ways to enhance TCAP's effectiveness by partnering with like-minded individuals and organizations to bolster our support for both the parents and their supports, their kin, their community, so that children can have a more effective education and have the supports that they need. If you want to learn more about the program or you want to donate to it, there's a QR code on the program's handouts that were around. You can feel free to check that out. Okay. I could clearly talk about CFCC forever, our vision, our programs, all of it. But that's not why we're here today. So let's turn to the focus for why we're here today. When Shanta and I first started planning for the symposium, we quickly realized that we needed to continue the conversation about family integrity that was started last year at the symposium. And we decided we really needed to deeply look into the issue of harm of removal. And, you might ask, why harm of removal for a big conference convening type thing that's going to bring folks from all over the place? And it's because harm of removal is a transformation point where everyone in our field can find some common ground. Whether you're a parent's attorney or a children's attorney or a government attorney, whether you consider yourself an abolitionist or a reformer or a transformer, whether you are a Republican or Democrat or something else, whether you are anti-racist or colorblind or again, something else, there's space for all of us to agree that children shouldn't be removed from their families unnecessarily. And that we should always try to mitigate, prevent, and heal the harm of removal. But there are some important differences in our perspectives and our individual knowledge that we've got to address if we're going to be able to work together and collaborate and strategize around ending the harm of removal. At a baseline, we have to know what it is that we're meaning when we say harm of removal. So when we talk about harm of removal and family separation, we're talking about children that are separated from their families of origin at the behest of a government entity. So this includes children who are separated from their parents and caregivers during the immigration processes, accused youth who are separated from their families through detention or commitment, youth who are separated from their families due to their parents' confinement or incarceration, children who have been separated from their families by the Child Protection Services agencies and put into foster care or hidden foster care. We're going to get into the statistics, kind of each of those buckets of court systems as we go throughout our panel discussions today. But here's a little spoiler alert. The statistics are outrageous. And the racial disparities across all of those systems are enough to make you want to cry. But I do want to take a second to kind of zoom out and consider the entirety of the numbers of children who are experiencing family separation across those silos and across our court systems. I know I'm a lawyer. I was a social worker first, and I did like some data. I reached back into that and did a little bit of math, just addition, nothing too fancy, no regressions or anything. But by looking at the most recently available government data, looking at some of the data that's been provided through nonprofit agencies that do some excellent research, my best estimate is that it's 2.4 million children every year who are separated from their parents. To help us really appreciate the number of children that this is, I did a little bit more math. This is like multiplication and division, but I'm feeling pretty good about it. I'm gonna help walk us through to help us visualize what this number of children is. So 2.4 million children. I want you to take a second and look around the room. See all the chairs. If every chair in here was filled with children, and you multiplied that by 100,000, that's how many children are separated from their parents. If you wanted to take a moment, just 1 second, to look at a picture of each of those children, you'd need the entire month of February. If all 2.4 million children who are removed from their families were to hold hands and stretch out their arms, they would be able to almost reach Chicago from here. The sheer number of children that experience family separation and removal should upset us all. But it's the harm of that removal that we're here to learn about. And I want to take a minute to speak to everyone in the room who's like me, who has facilitated or advocated or approved or ordered or carried out a removal of a child from their family. I'm so glad you're here. I'm glad you're here with me. I've been in those situations, both professionally and personally, where I've been confronted with a question: should a child be separated from their families in the name of child protection? And for the cases of severe abuse, that initial removal decision, it was much easier for me to come to a conclusion about. But what about at day 7, when a child misses their grandmother's birthday? Or at day 50, where that child's only been able to spend about 3 hours in the life of their newborn sibling's life because of the visit restrictions? Or at day 100 or 1,200, where the child is picked up by the police for having run away from the foster home back to the family that we removed them from. When I think about my role in separating children from their families, shame is right here, ready to eat me up. When I think about those cases where parents have been accused of failure to protect, quote unquote, or quote unquote, inadequate supervision, or quote unquote, inadequate housing, man, the shame feels heavy. And I know I'm not alone in this. And I get, that the 2.4 million number may not ever get down to zero. And I'm still wrestling through whether it should. Like, I believe in children's voice, and there are times where children have said, I need a minute, I need some separation and distance from my family. So I'm not even sure that zero is what I'm shooting for, but I'm still wrestling with the questions, and I've been wrestling with the questions. When should children ever be removed from their families? What makes me qualified to make that decision? And I know that there are social workers and judges and attorneys who have asked themselves these questions too. And I know there's other kin providers like me who've wrestled with that question. I'm still sitting, and I'm still learning, and I'm still lamenting and listening. And there's some questions that we have to continue to ask ourselves. When is removal necessary, and for how long? What if we did things differently? What if, when allegations were made, we took into account each child, each family member, each community, and used a strengths-based approach to support and heal families instead of harming them with removal? These are the questions that I think that we need to wrestle through. And our goal here is that we'll have some space and time to do that during this symposium. We're gonna wrestle through a lot of questions, but the goal of the symposium is to help give you an opportunity to grasp the social and economic harms of removal, to learn about the history of removal and family separation across systems and populations, to understand how removal perpetuates trauma and a lack of safety, especially and disproportionately amongst Black and Indigenous and other communities of color, to acknowledge how removal is linked to structural oppression of poor families, immigrating families, Black, Indigenous, and families of color. To consider who and how this history of removal needs to be acknowledged by, so that we can mitigate and heal and prevent intergenerational harms of removal. To practice listening and learning and being led by people who have lived experience with removal, and to begin strategizing for change, both at the individual and systems level, that will prevent unnecessary removal. It's a lot. We're going to try to do a lot today. There's a lot of bullet points. There's a long agenda. But I've got a couple of agreements that I'd like for us to come to an agreement with, so that we can honestly and respectfully have these discussions today. Now, you're going to hear some histories, some data, some testimonies that might make you feel uncomfortable. You might feel an urge to check out. And by all means, first bullet point up there, please take care of yourselves. But do what you can to stay engaged with the conversation, to stay curious and connected to the conversations we're having. Removal is an emotional topic. It might get a little loud in here, but I ask that you do not equate vitriol with volume. You might hear personal experiences today that don't align with your understanding of how these systems are supposed to work. And I'm asking, you might feel tempted to try to put forward some data that has, a larger sample size. Please don't. Share the data and also honor the experiences that are shared here today. More than one thing can be true at the same time. Curiosity, compassion, and humility will help lead us to a path forward where we prevent, mitigate, and heal the harms of removal. So if you're on board with these requests, can you please raise your hand today? Thank you so much. Look at y'all. Great. During our breaks, we're going to have opportunities where we're going to have some prompts up, and you'll be able to use a QR code or a Mentimeter code to do some virtual processing of the information we've put out there today. And if Shanta and I have done our jobs well, which I think we normally do, there's going to be more information than you could possibly process put forward today. But we want today to be the beginning of a conversation and a dialogue. And after taking in some of this information, some of you all might decide you want to make some changes. Some of you might decide you want to change your location's laws. You might want to change how you represent parents or change how you make removal decisions. We want to be a part of your change. We want to hear your plans. We want to cheer you on, and we want to be part of your community of change. So please, stay in touch after today. Before I begin introducing our keynote speaker, Sixto, I want to thank you all for being here for this very important conversation. Every day since I lost my son in December has been an exercise in meaning making, and today is meaningful because you all showed up for this conversation. So thank you so much. Now, it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker and my friend, Sixto Cancel. Sixto is a visionary founder and CEO of Think of Us, which is turning 10 this year, or next year. Next year it's turning 10. I want a ticket to the party. It's been established. I'm always down for a celebration. And Think of Us is a nonprofit research and design lab aimed at ensuring youth and families have the conditions they need to heal, develop, and thrive. Led and guided by people who have been impacted by child welfare, Think of Us partners with leaders and practitioners across the country to create and implement disruptive, scalable solutions and policy reforms. TED, the one that does the TED Talks, they recently this spring awarded Think of Us $47.5 million to aid towards the organization's $100 million goal to be able to build a child welfare system that invests in families and child well-being. Sixto is an incredible leader, mobilizer, storyteller, and problem solver. Sixto is also very, very generous. I first met Sixto during the pandemic. We were on a coalition Zoom call because we were all on Zoom calls, and we were trying to make sure the government was going to make sure children and youth who were in foster care could continue to have, housing and food when things were shutting down during the pandemic. Sixto emailed me afterwards, found a time for us to connect, and identified multiple ways that he could help orient me to the federal policy space. This was back when I first started at First Focus. He's always been quick with a hug and a smile and some data to help me figure things out. So ladies and gentlemen, Sixto Cancel.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to have this conversation. And today's a very special day because of not just this particular gathering, and we're talking about the harms of removal, but what we're really talking about is the power of keeping families together whenever possible. And one of the things that just is happening real time is that at 3:30 today, the Secretary Becerra, the kinship care rules are actually live as of literally 15 minutes ago. Let me rephrase so that folks understand the impact. We're talking $1.4 billion over the next 4 years to allow kin to actually be able to be paid like foster parents and have a kin-specific process. So your emails should be buzzing.
Yeah.
Exactly. But to get to this conversation, I just wanted to take a moment because so many of you have worked on that in this room for a long, long time. And so it is a moment for the field. All righty, but let's get to this convo and then
Yeah.
we are going to get to that later.
Yeah, we will. I gave a high level introduction to you and to think of us, but can you share a little bit more about you and the work?
Yeah, so a little bit about me. I see some new faces. So for those of you who don't know me, I grew up in the foster care system, entered as an 11-month baby. And my mother's story was that when she was 12, she revealed to her mother that she was being sexually abused. And so her mother had the tough choice of having multiple children saying, what do I do in this situation? And so she made the choice to abandon my mother. And so between 12 to 21, my mother lived on the streets. And so by the time she had me at 26 and she was in court and we were removed, you know, her intervention assigned by the courts were parenting classes. Her intervention assigned by the courts were rehab. But how many of us know that no parenting classes in the world can actually heal the trauma work that you need to do when you've experienced that as a child? The missed opportunity of years of schooling that are related to income, right? And so when I think about these moments where removal is possible, you know, there's a piece of me that hopes that those moments start to convert to moments of actual intervention. And so I came back into the system at the age of 6, was placed back with my biological mother for 11 months and 3 weeks, and then found myself back in the system and adopted at the age of 9. And that adoption was riddled with racism. While the white-skinned kids got to go to a private school, I was told I had to go to a public school. While they had rooms, I had the attic, right? And so I was treated very differently until about 13 when I started couch surfing, and then had to really fight the system to actually be removed and placed in foster care. But after recording the abuse, after actually documenting, I was able to come back in. And that's where my passion for systems became born. Because for me, it was about what in the world happened that I had to actually fight so hard to get back into the system. I had to provide the evidence. If I would have known that the key word was, I don't feel safe, and that automatically gets you to a new place, I would have been like, yep. But when they would ask me, I'm like, I ain't gonna die today. You know, if anybody knows me, just imagine me at 13. And so came back in and ended up aging out. And since then, just been super involved in how do we have an actual shifting of the DNA and the structure of this actual system.
Yeah. And, you know, data has been something that Think of Us has been really at the forefront of. Maybe you can share a little bit about like the organization and some of the ways in which you're using data to transform.
Absolutely. So one of the honors that I had was to be trained in different fields, from the technology field to the systems change field outside of child welfare. And there I just learned the power of data, but particularly data that comes from the people who are most impacted. We try to solve so many problems from a point of view without the folks who have lived experience. And then when we do actually engage folks with lived experience, we engage a small number of folks and then make decisions. And so the question for us was, how might we actually engage hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of people and being able to see what is that collective experience across county line, across state lines, and then being able to actually inform. And so we have had year after year, thousands of folks share information about themselves. We've taken that information from literally the local level of their county all the way up to the White House, and informing things like the White House Hunger Conference and having a particular strategy for young people who were suffering from food insecurity, right? Informing the Chafee, what you call it, the Division X funds from Chafee during the pandemic, which was $400 million. Now, all of this is in conjunction with folks. We exist to be in collaboration with folks to help be part of the acceleration. So I don't take any credit for attribution for those things. Let me be very clear. But we leverage the power of data and putting things into context for systems change.
Yeah, no, for sure. I remember relying heavily on the data that you all were able to acquire during the pandemic while we were doing that advocacy, for sure. It's been so important. Data is so important. And don't know that everybody in this room, we've got folks who are in the youth justice system space, we've got folks who are the immigration space. So maybe what would be helpful, if you could help kind of level set for us about the kind of basic data for numbers of children that are involved with the child welfare system.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for decades and decades, like we have talked about this problem and saying like 400,000, 500,000 young people are in foster care. And I believe that we have actually led with the wrong narrative. Every single year, there are 7 million children who are part of a child abuse investigation, or part of a child abuse report. And when we actually break that down, that's almost 10% of all children in the country, because there's 74 million children under the age of 18. And so when I think about what is that opportunity to actually provide support instead of to investigate and provide harm, I think that's a big opportunity there. And then when we break it down even more, what we know is that 33% of all families before their child's 18th birthday will experience a child abuse investigation, an actual knock on the door. And when it comes down to Black families, that is 53%. 53%.
So that's like 1 out of 2.
1 out of 2. American Public Health Journal, so it doesn't get more academic than that. You know, sometimes these numbers are hard to believe, but they're real. And then when we start to actually think about and investigate where this is at, you got 67 counties who are responsible for 40% of the entries in about 11 states.
Wait a second. Help me understand that. How many?
67 counties.
67 counties for how many?
In about 11 states that are responsible for about 40% of the
40%.
entries.
So like close to 50% of all of the entries are coming out of 67
hotspots.
Hotspots.
And so what does this mean? That even if you believe in investigation, we're actually doing it wrong, because you can't tell me this problem exists mainly in 67 counties, right? And so the math is not mathing.
Isn't math?
Like, let's lay it out. And then when we even break this down, when I look at the reform efforts, you know, we will go to New York City, we will go to Chicago, we will go to these places where there are big systems, but the majority of young people who have a child welfare involvement are actually living in jurisdictions that have less than 1,000 involvements a year.
Wow.
And so when we talk about scaling solutions, what do these solutions need to look like? Because we've been focused on the outliers because of the numbers of folks, but in total systems, we actually have more young people in these alternative suburban rural areas. Now, don't be misquoting me out here talking about something I don't believe in urban intervention, okay? But the facts are the facts around where are our children, if we're talking about scaling solutions, how might we really be thinking about that in the contents of a system that is smaller at the county level at these different kind of intensity points?
Yeah. Man, that's so important. I mean, help us understand, like, how many of those children who go through the investigations are then removed, and then how long are they in foster care? And yeah.
So when we look at digging down even deeper, you know, right now we have about 200,000 kids who come into care, right? And then there's a couple 100,000 more that actually are referred to a service, screened in, screened out of service. But about a year, there's about less than 1 million families who are either being investigated, being placed in foster care, or being referred. So we spend $33 billion a year on less than 1 million.
33 billion? With a B.
With the B.
Okay.
Yes, a year, and 11 billion of federal money. So we got a little money problem, but it's not that I think there's opportunity to do some analysis to understand, is it that we don't have enough money in the sector, or is it that we spend money in the wrong ways? Because I can tell you right now, we have funded kinship care navigation lines for $20 million a year. The Chafee funds that fund older youth are about $143 million a year. And yet the state of California and the state of of New York spend collectively $180 million on antiquated software built in 1980s and the 1990s. And so what we have in this country is the feds actually reimbursing $200 million across the country for software that was built in the 1980s. So don't tell me there's not money. It's just who's getting the money is who has the ability to draw it down and outcompete us. But yet we disrespect kin families by giving them $20 million for the country, thinking that that's enough.
Tell us a little bit about what the data says about the economic status of the children and families that are removed from and put into foster care.
Yeah, so Chapin Hall did their analysis and saw that over 80% of folks are making less than $50,000 a year.
So across all of the country.
Out of everyone who has a child welfare involvement case. And when we look deeper, 37% are making less than half the federal poverty rate, which is about $12,500. And so what we have is a lot of poverty here. Now, let's not be mistaken, like there are people who do bad things and we need to protect children, right? But in that same conversation, I do believe that we have the wrong children in the wrong system and the wrong intervention, and that families should be having an alternative to that. So to me, both things are true. There are bad people, and we got to make sure there's a response to those bad people. But then I think one thing I have here that we don't talk enough about, and this is my theory, so somebody needs to do some double digging and some due diligence here, but I'm gonna share it with you. When I start to think about the 47 states that have a state, neglect and registry, child and abuse and neglect registry, what we know about certain states is that when you're on that list, you cannot work as a nurse, you cannot work as a teacher, you cannot work with children. So when 1 in 10% of all Black children are actually removed and will experience foster care, what this also tells me is like, what percent of that 1 in 10 of Black families are actually having a record now? And what is the economic barrier of that record as they try to provide for their children? And so what we do know is that there is a correlation between poverty and what your income is and the probability of having that family stay together. And so when we look at life outcomes of children and family, there is a correlation, I would say, of a big impact for the Black population nationwide, period, that is on this registry that is actually limiting potentially their income. So I would love to dig into that. That is a hypothesis to test. So if you quote me, say it was a hypothesis, it's not. But I think these are the things that we have to start to look at and start to actually think about, when you do have states like Massachusetts who has an equity task force, the conversation also needs to be about child welfare. We cannot have a conversation about equity without actually having these conversations about child welfare and their effects.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that that's like so shocking. And I was so glad when we kind of were talking about this talk today. I reached out to a friend of mine. I was like, I got to talk to Sixto today because he's kind of famous. And I was like, he told me, about the impacts of being on the registry and how prolific this is. And my friend was like, wait a second, you go on a registry if you were in the child abuse system? And I was like, oh yeah, like when they do background checks, they're not just checking like whether you have a criminal system record or not. They're also looking at the child abuse and neglect registry. And the impact that the way that creates barriers for families to be able to get jobs, right? So do you know any more about like what jobs are you not able to get if you're?
So my understanding, and I think this varies state for state, but like working with children, right? I wonder about the implication of that parent who wants to chaperone. I wonder about the implication for that teacher who had a situation. Recently, we had a birth parent roundtable, and someone who had worked in the state, for 9 years, had, the adverse effect of having a case and then couldn't be in her role anymore. And so when I think about the impact, it goes way beyond what we have had the normal conversation around. It is pervasive to this community.
Yeah. These are really real and really problematic issues for sure. When you and I talked, we talked about like some of that work that you were doing with birth parents. I don't know if there's a story or something that you like want to share with some more of those conversations.
Yeah, when you talk about this, one of the stories that we heard in our work there was about a CPS investigation that this parent was going through. And what she was talking about was she was about to be evicted. She said, look, I have, CPS starting to knock on this door. I need to make sure that I have housing, because she knew that the moment she didn't have housing, that the probability of her children was going to be removed. So she went where she had always gotten help for the past 2 years, which was a nonprofit that was supporting her in her journey in recovery. And when she said, hey, I need to access your housing program, they said, you've been clean for more than 90 days. You cannot access this program. And so what she did was she relapsed intentionally so that then she can qualify for that program, and took her chances to have relapse being part of the CPS investigation, right? And so just so that she can get housing, because the probabilities for her was at least if she was in a program with her children, that then she had a greater likeliness to stay with her kids. And so these are the stories around, like, how does this happen? Eligibility, financing, from the feds to the state, from the state to the programs, the multiple regulations that are put on it. Like, what we have is a broken operational process of so many things that then you end up with things of this nature where the restriction of itself perpetuate the actual damage and trauma for cases like this.
Yeah. It's so heartbreaking. And it's a prolific problem, I think, just in general, right? Like, I think Shanta kind of talked about this a little bit, or maybe we were talking about it a while ago. You have to, so many families have to get back into a harm in order to get help. What are, there's moral issues here, there's legal issues here. There are so many economic barriers that are put before families whose children have been removed. What do you think the social and economic barriers are in terms of their ability to reunify, right? So like, we're talking about like preventing removal, mitigating the harm, healing, reunification is part of that healing process. How do you see these barriers kind of showing up on that kind of later end of the spectrum?
Yeah, so there's a council in New Jersey of about 5 young people who have been reunified. And I don't know any other youth council of young people who have been reunified. And if you know one, please let me know, because I would like to talk to them too. But what was interesting to me about this group of young people is that when they talked about their journey back at home, we talk about so much, okay, you're back at home, great. But the supports that they need in that journey of healing and reacclimating, experiencing parenting after removal, like those become some of the traumas and some of the deepest work that even if you avoid coming back into the system, what you do not avoid is how that affects you moving forward, how that affects you as that teenager, how that affects you in your young adulthood. And so when I think about what does a real robust system look like, it needs to encapsulate like how do we actually support when a child goes home. And I think that right now, we are in the greatest moment to actually continue to lean into that. You have prevention that's coming up, and none of these are silver bullets, right? I just want to be very straightforward about that. And yet, I feel like it is our responsibility to lean in and to try to make the best of the different kind of transition points that we're at as a sector. And so the first thing that I see is prevention, being able to be a limited opportunity to draw down some funds to fund mental health, to fund substance abuse programs, and to fund parenting classes. Yeah, they want to call it education. I call it oppression. So when I think about that system, there's opportunity, but it's also riddled with the racism of like less than 4% of Black leaders actually get philanthropic funds. And then who gets unrestricted funds is even lower than that when it comes down to interventions led by people of color. And so what does that mean? Well, in order to access those funds in a state, you have to be picked out of the clearinghouse, something that should be blown up in my personal opinion. And the evaluation is extremely expensive, right? We're talking, small programs, $500,000, $100,000 to like get your eligibility just to start the actual evaluation. And those are real numbers that I have paid. So like, it is crazy to think that, you know, these interventions for a group of folks that look like the folks that they want to serve, you then have that dynamic. And we actually run the California Kinship Warm Line, right? We serve about 2,000 families a year, connecting them to resources. And in that, when we were doing the work, we looked at the 2,000 applications. We were able to profile folks into different categories. And so you had the first category of folks who, you know, respectfully, I felt like based on the applications, you can probably navigate this on your own. And so, you know, deploying staff felt different in terms of urgency there. The last class, though, out of the three, high basic needs, making under $30,000 a year, behavioral issues at home, mental health issues at home, and they had more than 4 complex issues going on. I feel like no matter who shows up at the house, like we gonna need a whole tactical team to really wrap around this family. But the crazy part about it is that our contract and actually the regs allow us to be like, you are ineligible for our services because your needs are too great. And so we could have discriminated against 37% of actually everyone who qualified, and then went ahead and go for an evaluation and say, well, our evaluation is showing that we're doing good because we're serving the people who could probably Google the resource that they needed. And that is no shade, but that is the truth of what this is. Now, obviously, we served everyone, and we reached out to everyone. But the reality is that the actual legal contracting, the procurement, the financing, these things that I feel like we have to dig into more are so riddled with being able to have every excuse not to actually serve the families who are hardest to serve. And then we have a culture of saying, how do you scale? How many people are you serving? How do you get there? But some of this work is deep and it is very concentrated and it requires you to lean in. And so if you run an organization like Monarch Family Services, you're like, there's a viewpoint for some folks, they're out of Texas, they can be like, oh, well, you only serve 200 folks. But the reality is like, when you look at that, the continuum of services between the state funding and the philanthropic funding that they have built a continuum. They have wrapped around those families in such a way that the probability of their success, it's like, try them. You know what I'm saying? Like, they are winning. And so what I think we need is like to bolster up our prevention services, to have a lot more in-home services, to pay for that with other buckets. You know, I see Shaquita here, and Intercept is a great program that has strong evidence of working, right? I think that we have to actually create a streamlined process with these rules allow for today, as of today, around kinship care. And yes, states could have had waivers. I'm not gonna get into that argument today. But to be able to streamline kin, to be able to take care of their relatives, and then to be able to rethink like, not just paying kin, but what are the supports that are needed? Why does it take a little bit longer? And maybe that is okay, right? When you're living with aunt and grandma, like maybe that is the opportunity for everyone to do the deep work that's necessary to actually increase the outcomes for that family as a whole. And I do believe that if you have these two sides of the system, kin and prevention, that could we possibly see the smartphone effect? The smartphone was never designed to compete with the actual phone. That design team was like, how do we connect the world more than ever before? It so happens that we should leverage a phone call and a text message. But that was not the excitement of that team. When you talk to those folks, when you watch documentaries like Generation Magic, like these were folks who were like, how do we create community digitally? And that's why they came out with apps, right? And when we look at that, it leveraged a bit of the current infrastructure of phone lines and text lines. But then on top of that, there was a whole new infrastructure that was built that was actually adding value in such a different way that then that became the way of going forward. And to me, that's what I actually call transformation versus a reform. You leverage a bit of that infrastructure and then you move forward at the speed of light, building the new. And what prevention and what kinship care can be is that piece of the new infrastructure that allows us to actually move forward, but the organizing, the thoughtfulness, the actual solving to the right problems are going to be key in actually being able to be successful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so much great knowledge, and I think like, we gotta thank you for that. And everything that you're sharing about too, it ties back to the harm of removal, because these are the harm of removal. I mean, it's 2.4 million children, right? There are going to be so many different ways in which we're going to have to work to get that number down, right? And even with the number, when we get it down, there's all of this healing that we need to do, and resourcing and support for the families that leave and that are still in the system. So thank you so much for sharing all that. I want to give us a little bit of time to share questions. Where am I on time?
Oh, we
Okay.
got time.
We have 10 minutes? Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. So we're gonna give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. Come on up there. We've got two microphones, and if you need assistance, please just raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you. Oh, let me make sure it's on. You got it. Thank you. There you go.
Hola.
Hola.
So I have a question. It's more of a statement, but just flipping the lens from a different view in terms of providing, I think you touched it, providing the attention and the level of resource that a child who is traumatized would need when entering into care. So I'm also a kinship care receiver. I was raised by my grandmother, but I've witnessed the children who, Sixto, you said the term, I don't feel safe. And young people are learning those key phrases, even when they're not being honest, right? So I'm flipping to the opposite end when a child comes into a home or into care and will say, someone touched me, or someone did harm when it didn't actually happen, and cause that implosion that happens when a child says, I'm not safe, even if that parent or that household did not provide or exacerbate any harm.
Mm-hmm.
What are suggestions and solutions for getting the children who are moving through these systems the resources and tools that they need mentally to address their traumas, so that they don't make poor decisions that can alienate in some regards and stop a family that is providing safety from being removed? I don't even know how else to phrase that.
Yeah, when I think about, things of, the first piece of that is like, okay, when people have trauma responses, there's so much more that has to be built that is beyond child welfare. So how do we get innovative? By pulling in resources from other systems, but those systems are just as broken. And so I think that there's this argument around like, is this child welfare's responsibility, or is it behavioral health responsibility, or is it mental health responsibility? And the system that you end up playing with is the system that ends up financing an intervention. But that intervention sometimes is not the intervention that is actually going to meet the need. And so what I wonder is there a world where we get to the point where, regardless of what door a child comes in, that once they hit child welfare, that we have the ethos, that we have the culture to say, this is ours, and we're gonna figure out how to solve so much of it. And I don't know if we'll get there. I do see different nonprofits who are like, we're gonna braid our funding, we're gonna go get resources to develop interventions that would help children actually respond to, support children who are having those trauma responses. Hello.
Well, good morning.
Yeah.
I'm gonna segue into the whole collaboration and transformation instead of
Do you mind stepping to the mic? I'm having trouble hearing you. Thank
Okay.
you.
I said, I want to dive into collaboration and transformation and adjacent to the reformation process. I work in an environment where we are court enforced, so we are removing. I work in the juvenile justice system. And so how pivotal, based on some of the statistics that you have shared with us this morning, is it that we take that collaborative approach and not just say that the state is going to do the reformation process, we're going to move from this piece to this piece, and still not inundate our families with so much that we are missing a significant amount of the point of unification for the family. So how do we approach that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna start off by saying something that's actually probably very impossible. I mean, unpopular.
Oh, popular, okay.
Unpopular. Well, unpopular, sorry, I'm making up words. At a university at that. But that's how you call new phrases.
Beyonce did it.
Okay. I want to say, I actually believe we're not removing enough children from the right situations. And I think you can't tell me that out of 74 million children who are under 18, that 200,000 is the number that we should be focused on, especially when the 200,000 consists of 63% of those being neglect cases, right? And so, again, the math ain't mathin'. And so I think that there is some work to do around where do we need to be doing removals versus not. And so that will be my first point. In terms of collaboration, when I started as the 15-year-old who went to that youth board, I started my journey with it was a healing journey for me to advocate and say these things happened to me and it was wrong. And then I transitioned from that place of being to being holy crap, you have more responsibilities to actually represent the trending stories. Because the reality is that most kids come into the foster care system and they're home within a year. Teenagers come in and they experience about 6 placements, but the journey of a life longer, that is not as common as the actual typical experience. And so then it became about how do you represent those who are in your situation? But all of it was advocacy and all of it was pointing to what was wrong. And then I hit that point where I was like, what is the true contribution here? Because one day I'm going to turn 30 and I'm going to have too much hair on my face and I won't be picked from the panels. Everyone would have heard your story, and then you're done, and on to the next one who's 18, 19 and hitting the panels and supporting people's agenda. And so that's when I quit everything. There was a time, y'all might remember, I was like, deuces to everybody, to be able to figure out what was my true contribution. And so I believe as much as I want to get into the advocacy space and call people out and do that, because I could give a good clap back. I realized that what we actually were missing were people to co-design and have the actual co-solutioning. Because someone has to actually be in the state and listen to, this judge I was talking to at this one conference and say, he's like, I believe in family, but I believe in mitigating my liability even more.
Yeah.
And I was like, because he was like, I know the foster parent at least went through this training, but I do not know this aunt. And so I'm not taking that risk because if something happens to this child, it's on me. And I think those conversations are so hard to be a part of, but they are actually the conversations and the way that we need to wrestle with material, with folks. And we can only do that when we start to build resilient relationships and allowing those conversations to happen. But what the field has done, it has leveraged lived experience folks to be the advocates that then when an organization or someone doesn't want to point out stuff, sometimes they will put us front and center. They have glorified the pointing out of problems, but have not structured an ability to actually participate in actually saying, here's what co-solutioning look like. And so to me, some of this is the greatest manipulation and the greatest tokenism because you literally have folks believing that they are having a strong contribution, but the boxes have been drawn out so much that, I don't think as a sector, we've gotten to the point where we authentically integrated folks. Now, there are pockets of it. We do see people with lived experience in policy. We do see people with lived experience in research, leading organizations, and we see more of that more than ever before. And yet, as a sector, I would say we're still hitting that cusp. So that's what I would say around collaboration. And then let's just get really real. The reality is that sometimes we don't play well together. And I will say sometimes I've been guilty of that in my younger years, maybe 2 years ago. And the reality is when you have a sector that is so resource deprived, right? We're talking about the biggest players not even giving away $100 million a year. But when we look at criminal justice, we see the average philanthropic outpour of that being so much more than $500 million a year, right? When we look at these other sectors, they are resourced differently. So it allows for a different type of collaboration because we are not crabs in a barrel. But the reality is that in this sector, you have your main players that, to no fault of them, so don't go over here talking, but to no fault of them, we are competing against each other in such a way that it is very difficult to have aligned contribution and move forward in that sense, because you have to attach the recognition to your nonprofit, to your name, to be able to even sustain your staff.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. You know it's gonna be trouble with this guy. Come on.
It's gonna be deep. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be great is what it's gonna be. It's gonna be great.
It just made me just change up a whole lot right there, but, so you mentioned earlier, you would have had to discriminate against 37%, right? So that's connoting that there's about 73%, if we just took that as a microcosm, 73% of people who would have been able to navigate Googleable things on their own. So, from my worldview and ideology and so many others, we believe that there are some conditions that have been created that we don't question why they're still existing, right? So those conditions are created, and that's why we often go to, there are some children that need to be removed, because you mentioned those boxes. We're still in the box of feeling that we need this system. So left to my own devices, historically, we were good before government intrusion. Like perfectly good, left to our own devices before the government got involved, people were doing okay. Now, with that, moving to collaboration and playing well together, I think that we haven't gotten into a space or position where we embrace extreme disagreement so that we can move forward.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's necessary. We don't need to play in quasi-harmony. We don't have to build together, but we need to understand where we are fully, so we know who we're building with, or who we're in this sort of ecosystem with. With all of that said, there's a narrative that's being told, right? That's a false narrative about abolitionists, right? And I'm just curious if so there's a difference between the two, the ISTS, right? And then there's abolitionism, right? And so that's an ongoing struggle, right? So what are your beliefs in this sphere? I dare call it a field, right? Because that's taking me back to a place that I don't want to recall so much, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Plantation. Yes, the plantation. So what are your thoughts about abolitionism, not abolitionists, because I don't want to get into principles before personalities and all of that.
Yeah. So when we look at this is such an ecosystem problem. And so to solve problems, we are going to need people on the entire movement. So when I think about the civil rights movement and I think about the march, right, on Selma, there were folks who literally trained to be on that front line. They were spit on, yelled at as part of their training, pushed so that they can be trained they can be trained to have a nonviolent reaction, right? There were folks who were like, love y'all, support the movement, but I'm cutting the checks for the buses. You ain't gonna have me out there, right? There were folks who were on the phones and ready to be like, when y'all get arrested, I'm gonna be there. And so the reason I mention some of this is because when I think about movements and I think about Dr. King and I think about Malcolm X, it was absolutely necessary to get to the larger goal, the existence of all of these different perspectives. And that the collective strategy and the collective mindsets and how at the sector level people were tugging and pushing, that actually is how solutions are starting to become at the sector and ecosystem level. I think that we get so caught up actually perpetuating what child welfare teaches us. There must be a decision point at the court, right, where we decide who is right and who is wrong. and we can coexist. Because the reality of it is that when you're trying to address such a big problem, the answer is never going to be just one or the other, or even two of those things. You actually need a continuum of people to actually be pushing back and forth. And I think that our country is at a point where losing that value, or that value is not being modeled in the same way that it was modeled previously. When we look at Congress, right? We're heading for a government shutdown. Probabilities are high.
I hope not.
The number one skill set that they should have about coming across the lines, compromising, and like what I feel like is their job description, it's not being met. And so when I think about what's the parallel in child welfare, I think that it has been so divisive, and I have refused to get into the conversation because it is actually not helpful for us to be like, I'm anti-abolitionist, or I'm anti-reform, or I'm a reformer, or XYZ. Those are the wrong conversations, because what it does, it ostracizes. It says us against you. And we too freaking small to be over here trying to be like my crew versus your crew. Because at the end of the day, child welfare is this big. You know, like we are so tiny compared to the bigger social service sector. And so I think there's work to be done to actually say, you know, how do we actually solve the problems we can solve together? But then how are actually different solutions are being created at the different places of the spectrum?
Right ahead. Well, are we, last one? Okay. Oh, no, here, feel free to tilt it down. You're good. Yeah, there you go. Whoop, hold it, go ahead. That's fine.
So it might be quick, it might not. So as a previously used token to now being in a space where I feel like I can make real change. And recently having an experience where I had to choose between my siblings and my career.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing what the experience is of removal and how the effects that it has had on my family previously and what it can continue to do. What advice do you have for leaders in this field and potential kinship care guardians as they move to fight for the right to be there for their family members?
Yeah. So one of the things I want to address before I go deep into the answer is, you know, the feeling of tokenism. And I think so much of the key to that is really laying out expectations. When we're engaging folks, one of the things that we've learned the hard way, and possibly some of you in the room, is that we inspire people, we tell them to be part of this, we tell them that you're an expert, that you're a leader, and yet we're working within a container where things take 3 to 7 years to move the needle. And without that expectation being set, then you do X, Y, Z, and then you're like, where's the change? And then you be like, it never came. So what the hell was the point, right? And so I think when I think about our leaders who have that lived experience, that needs to be so addressed, because it is easy to be frustrated and then say, hey, here's my experience with this. And so when I now transition to your question around the advice to kinship care folks in that position, you know, my brother is one who I had the opportunity to take in. And I was living in Richmond, Virginia at the time, and he was living in Connecticut. Very different laws, very different contexts. And what I, you know, came to the hard decision of that same decision around, you know, what do I do? Because it would be my career with his needs, his behavioral needs, his mental health needs, all the ways that I need to show up. And, you know, I ended up saying, I can't take him in. And that was hard because I knew what that meant and I knew what those things were. And I also was like, Virginia police don't play. So I'm not, and police were a constant presence in his narrative to this day. And so I was like, Connecticut police, a little different, ain't that too much different, but way, you know, way better than the context of Virginia in terms of laws and things that happen. So I think there are moments where we come to this and we are just living in the reality, and the harsh reality is that sometimes we are equipped to do that work. And when we are equipped to like give it our all and like engage, like there is an opportunity to lean in. But then sometimes I feel like the supports weren't there for me, right? I knew that, look, I ain't gonna have you in the middle of the night standing over me, which is some of the things, he would do. It's just like, there were some things where I was like, I need some real supports to be in this home in order to make it happen. And so I had to really make the hard choice that I couldn't actually be there, and that potentially I would actually be doing more harm and actually taking him in and then having to have the experience where, he wouldn't be able to live in that house. And so we're faced with those hard decisions every day, and so my advice is like, focus in on like what the true opportunity is, and then reconfigure what your contribution is. Because for him, what I was able to do is say, I'm gonna go ahead and support you in navigating the behavioral health system. I'm gonna advocate. I'm gonna go ahead and, be at the court hearings, and I'm gonna hold you accountable, because you ain't gonna go ahead and be doing all this and then me spending all this time and you ain't doing your part either. And there have been times where I had to say, Judge, I think it's time that he is committed for this moment, and we still can have that resilient relationship. Judge, I think you're wrong. And so I think those are hard parts to navigate, but there is a way that we could always show up. It doesn't mean showing up in sometimes the way that we feel is binary, like take him in or not take him in. And those are some of the hardest choices that we have to live with, and potentially a couple Thanksgivings down the line, you got to have that conversation again of why the situation was there. So it's not a one-year thing. It's pervasive, yeah.
Okay, we need to set up for our next panel, but is it a short question?
Yes.
Okay, we'll do this last question because I don't want to cut it off, and then we're going to transition to.
And maybe you've already talked about this as I got here late, so please apologize. So you talked about the child welfare system, and I'm a social worker. There are over 700,000 social workers in this country. Probably 330,000 of those social workers work in the child welfare system. And you're talking about collaboration, and you're talking to judges. My biggest concern as a social worker is, and I want to know, what are the conversations that you're having with social workers who are in those homes, making these biased decisions, removing kids, as you said, and I agree with you, when they shouldn't necessarily, where are we focusing on the kids that need to be removed? There's no collaboration there when we have our social workers working with the parents, and then the social workers who say they're at DSS and working on behalf of the families, and they're really not. What's the collaboration, and what's the advice for us as social workers in bridging that gap, because we're failing?
First of all, I want to say, like, I feel like, now I'm on the other side and I have a direct service staff. And so karma's real for every time I gave a social worker some problems. Now I'd be like, really, this is on my desk? I would say, like, the context in which the work is being done is almost as if people are being set up to fail in the first place. And so when we think about 40–60% vacancies that are happening to multiple systems across the country, not just child welfare, but housing and so forth, how in the hell are you supposed to manage when half your team is gone? And then when this is TMI probably, I was going on a date with someone, and he was a CPS worker, and I couldn't do it. And let me explain why. And it was the indoctrination of, like, you're following the rules to the T, as an entry-level person who is doing this work, and you can't even see the harm. But why would we expect that you can see the harm without the true training and the apprenticeship? Yeah. And so for me, I think what's so crazy about this field is that we say, because you got your MSW, because you done this, and you did some shadowing while you were getting that MSW, I don't think that that's enough. I think we need to rethink what being with the elders who have been doing this work, who have figured out how to actually navigate those systems, and saying, hey, what does apprenticeship really look like? So even, the folks who are coming newly into that, they're being fed with I got to mitigate liability. I'm afraid to make decisions. Let me go ahead and be able to do this thing. So it's not intentional. No one's out here being like, I'm a social worker and I need to rip people away from their families. You know, it's so much more complicated. So I would say it's like really being able to advocate for how do you actually get the supports that you need, which is systemic. Secondly, there's some mindset shifting that needs to happen that is in the ethos of these actual systems. And for the record, we're still friends.
But thank you so much, Sixto, for all the wisdom and data you shared with us.